Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, Communicating to Move Forward from a Crisis, brought to you by the IABC Heritage Region in conjunction with the IABC Boston Chapter. I'm Greg McCormick, Communication Chair of the IABC Heritage Region. It's time for a thought-provoking session with our panelists. An all-encompassing crisis like a global pandemic puts you at ground zero. The way in which we communicate with employees makes all the difference in how individuals and the organization can move forward. This webinar will examine how the communication and HR teams at Cambridge Systematics work hand in hand to quickly recognize needs, respond effectively, innovate, and then shift again as the stages of the COVID-19 crisis changed. Presenters Dina Wolfman Baker, SCMP, Principal, Head of Marketing and Communication, and Leanne Gent, Chief Talent Officer at Cambridge Systematics. We'll discuss how team members access professional networks and leverage practices to the needs of the company and its staff. Dina leads a 27-person team for marketing and brand strategy, marketing communication, business development, and internal communication at Cambridge Systematics. During her more than 35 years professional experience, Dina has been bringing perspective from background gained in the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. In 2017, she earned the Strategic Communication Management Professional Certification. Leanne is Chief Talent Officer at Cambridge Systematics and a member of the executive leadership team. She is a solutions-focused, results-oriented, and decisive leader with 15 years of management experience across multiple industries. She's passionate about developing talent and building a dynamic organization in which employees can thrive and contribute to a broader mission. Before we begin, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. I'd like to introduce Amy Miller, an IABC Heritage Region member and our tech associate for today's webinar. Amy will review a few quick points to help you gain the most from this experience. Amy?
Thank you, Greg. Everyone, if you would like to watch today's webinar in full screen mode, then mouse to the top right portion of your screen and you'll see 4 small arrows. Click on that symbol to toggle in and out of full screen mode. During the presentation, if you'd like to send us a comment or question for discussion, please use the chat button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Just mouse down to the bottom of your screen and your toolbar will appear, including the chat button. Dina and Leanne will take questions partway through the session and again at the end of the discussion. If you'd like to join the conversation later via chat, right now we're showing some thought starters that may spur ideas for you. Also, today's webinar is being recorded. As a registered attendee, you will receive the following: a link to our very brief survey as you leave the webinar. Please take a moment to respond so we can keep making improvements. And you'll also get an email with links to today's presentation PDF, a recording of the session, and the survey again in case you missed it on your way out. And now back to Greg.
Thank you, Amy. Now let's get started. Dina, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen for everybody. So thank you, Greg. Thanks to the IABC Heritage Region, and thank you to the Boston Chapter for asking us to present this webinar. As we've all experienced, this was a fast-moving crisis that we've all been going through that has morphed into a still fluid but long-range crisis. What we're going to do today is look at about a 2-month time frame. And our discussion is structured around these 4 phases that you see on the screen. The recognition phase, in which we began formulating our response, was extremely quick. It occurred in the first week of March. The response development phase also took just a week, and we were able to use the framework we created then for several weeks during that early, fast-changing period.
And on April 3rd, we recognized the need to shift from urgent fluid communication to a more static communication platform with HR-driven content. And at the end of April, we were able to reflect upon some important lessons learned from this experience, what we could have been doing better prior to this, as well as practices that emerged from this that we want to institutionalize moving forward. I want to take this opportunity to provide some context and background prior to COVID's impact on our people and operations. So a little bit about Cambridge Systematics. We are a 230-person consulting firm with more than 45 years of experience leveraging technology and ingenuity to advance the world of transportation, with a focus on planning and policy, movement of people and goods, and software and design development. We have 12 offices across 10 states, plus some staff who did work from home prior to COVID, but were still assigned offices based on geography. Our employees are mostly exempt or salaried, and we hire a lot of analytical types who manage projects for clients. So they tend to have a lot of autonomy in their roles, and we as a firm have the ability to provide them with freedom and flexibility. That said, prior to COVID, we had a very traditional office-based view regarding how to work effectively, and we didn't embrace remote and flex work arrangements for the most part. Also, just wanted to, since I mentioned the autonomy and freedom, I think it's important to recognize that we must realize when we need to be prescriptive so that this freedom doesn't become a runaway problem where it's not feasible. So for example, when we're putting together our office reopening protocols. We do recognize that the type of work we do is, and the industry we're in, made it somewhat, less challenging than it was for other businesses to make the transition from office-based to remote. And we also recognize that as a privately owned company, we were able to prioritize staff preservation over profit. So meaning we were profitable enough to meet our financial obligations. I'm grateful that we haven't had to furlough or lay off any of our employees, but I realize that other businesses are having to deal with very difficult decisions. I've worked in the hospitality and healthcare industries, and I am empathetic to the challenges that leaders are currently facing. I felt like it was important to acknowledge that both Dina and I have worked in large global organizations as well and at publicly traded companies. So we believe that while businesses need to respond to crises by making the best decisions for their particular business model, employees, and their customer base, the practices we used and the impact we experienced and lessons learned, we do believe are applicable across company size, scope, and industry. And one last thing I just want to highlight is that the risk profile of our leadership team is cautious, and there is a strong desire to gain consensus when making decisions. This is important because, obviously during times of crisis, quick and thoughtful decisions must be made. And this style of decision-making absolutely pushes us outside of our comfort zone.
So I want to just comment for a moment on the image you see on this screen. We're using this to represent that sense of autonomy that Leanne described, and the fact that we are an independent employee-owned company. This is actually from an article I published on LinkedIn about the strength we gained in confronting COVID-19 through being that kind of company. Some of the things that we were communicating in the crisis were best handled top-down to impart information that would put employees at ease. But outside of that, we really had an opportunity to be more distributive and collective in communicating. We were able to lean into our culture as an employee-owned firm where staff feel a lot of autonomy. I also want to comment that while Leanne and I both work inside Cambridge Systematics, if you're an external communication consultant, I believe you actually are uniquely positioned with your more objective lens to introduce to your clients the importance of bringing into play the practices we will discuss. If there is no internal communication function at all, you can even offer to help build up this perspective within HR, given the HR comms joint perspective that we're going to be describing in this webinar.
Also thought we felt it was important for all of you to know about some change management work that was happening within our firm prior to COVID. Our CEO had made a commitment to our employees to proceed with several key organizational changes to improve our culture and our effectiveness. And he simply could not put all of these changes on pause because the employees were counting on him. They were counting on him to follow through based on how critical they are to their experience and to the future of the firm.
So this visual was developed for that change communication process to indicate the various streams of change and the various streams of employees and employee groups on a common path pulled together by a collective ambition, what we call our North Star. This also came to represent in many ways how we needed to manage the communication streams. We didn't want to let anything go. We were dealing with a significant load of communication streams. We had multiple change management threads. One of the challenges was how we leverage these with each other and with the need for significant communication on COVID without overwhelming employees or hijacking our change process. We were rolling out the collective ambition, structure changes, a strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we were joining all of this together as one CS. And then COVID hit. And then came the heightening of the Black Lives Matter movement, adding still another significant dimension. So this really became an important sort of symbolic image for what we were trying to do. I want to acknowledge that we did not arrive at our collective ambition and its streams of change communication entirely on our own. Knowing that we were taking on a large and critical scope of work, we brought in CRA, a communication consulting firm with which I've worked on several occasions, both for their exceptional perspective and to help augment our bandwidth. They helped us to define and put our collective ambition into words and structure and to develop the processes and streams for communicating it. I won't go into the specifics of that as we're focusing here on the crisis communications that then arose, but their work with us truly laid the foundation we needed to move forward from a communication perspective as the crisis hit. So now we are going to move from that background into the recognition phase.
Yes, and as you can see on the slide, we have various news clips from NPR, so it illustrates what was happening in the world, what was happening around us, and what was happening within our own lives. You know, for me, leading up to this week, we were already hearing a number of concerns from our employees. There was anxiety was definitely heightening. For example, one of our employees, an employee's spouse had recently traveled to China, and our employee had made the decision to self-quarantine on their own, and they were unable to, go into the office or do in-person client meetings. And another example is an employee came to HR to express fear over a colleague who sits in the cubicle next to them who was about to travel to Spain. They were extremely concerned about what this person might bring back with them to the office. At this time, I connected with two different peer groups, one through an association membership, Northeast Human Resources Association, and another, Resources for Humans, which is a Slack group for HR professionals in all industries around the globe. So at this stage, most of the dialogue was centered on how companies were handling business and personal travel. However, some businesses were already making plans to shut down offices and operations without waiting for guidance from government officials.
And what was happening with me? I attended a meeting on Friday, February 28th with people outside my company, where I learned that someone seated next to me had just returned from Tokyo. The following Tuesday, March 3rd, I started exhibiting what could have been symptoms. I immediately left the office. And I was out of the office until that Friday, the 6th, after the symptoms had subsided. At that time, it was not possible to get tested in Massachusetts. I was reading, I was listening widely, I was connecting with peers. COVID was the primary topic of that meeting on February 28th, which was a local peer group of communication executives. On March 4th, I began participating in a national peer group discussion on COVID via Teams, which is moderated by CRA, the consulting firm I mentioned earlier, and has about 300 members. On Friday the 6th, once I was back in the office, assuming I was healthy, Leanne and I met to strategize, pushing to convene a working group to develop a policy and respond and get ahead of this for our employees and provide them with the reassurance of clarity. I leveraged resources that would resonate with our leadership. For example, listening up to NPR on my way into work, I heard US Congressman Seth Moulton talk about a protocol format he had developed for his staff for expressing the stage of response that we are in. He's made it available on his website, and I seized on that format as something that would be effective with the people we needed to influence. And it became the basis for developing our own staff and office policy. It gave us a starting point so it didn't seem so overwhelming. There were two elements we went into this knowing we needed to address: our staff and office policy and our business continuity policy. So that was week one. Then we went into this phase of developing our response. The fact that we could be anticipatory was key to our success. On March 10th, the national peer group that I discussed also held pop-up meetings to discuss COVID over Teams. On March 11th, I call that the day our jobs changed. We each ended up with two parallel jobs, the one we always have and the COVID response job. We held meetings from 11 to noon and from 6 to 7:30 with this COVID response group that we had pushed into existence the week before on the 11th. And between those two meetings, we developed the entire draft protocol. On the 12th, we met and finalized the protocol. On the 13th, that Friday, we developed and launched all of our internal engagement platforms for work from home and for our information center for COVID to ensure continuity of culture and to ensure clarity. This speed of response, on the 10th and 11th, we held our first internal meetings. On the 13th, we have everything in place. This was a week when our staff were just beginning to report cancellations of client meetings, but mostly they were still on, and the only difference is that they were elbow bumping. By the next week though, no one was traveling. We had just gotten ahead of our market signals instead of reacting to them.
Yeah, and just to provide some insight as to what was happening with internal meetings, that this week, ending March 13th, the DEI Council participated in unconscious bias training and held a strategic planning session. Two members of the council were not comfortable flying and participated virtually. Our facilitators had to think on their feet on how to handle the breakout sessions due to this last minute change, which was interesting foreshadowing for all of us in this new virtual environment. We continue to have a number of questions coming in from staff. You know, are we shutting offices? Are we going to shut all offices at once? Are we going to listen to state and local officials? And we knew so that we were putting together this plan. So it was, you know, personally for us, there was some conflict. We had the questions coming in. We knew we had the plan sort of figured out, but we hadn't been ready to communicate that. So it was definitely a very anxiety provoking time for everyone.
When working on crisis communications, you have to put aside and make person neutral that you are also experiencing the crisis, even though you can't ignore that fact, and in fact need to use that personal experience to be open to the signals that it gives you about what's shaping up around us.
And this further reinforces this partnership between communications and human resources, that we need to be key partners and communicate in a way that connects with the emotional and human side of this. I mean, again, this is always true, but of course, especially true in times of crisis.
So I want to show you what we stood up for our initial COVID-19 information page on SharePoint. This is actually one generation than our original page. The CEO corner, which you can probably barely see, but I'll show you close-ups in a moment, at the top right, didn't exist when we first launched. And in fact, its appearance later became the first indicator that the nature of the page and its leadership would change, but we'll get into that at the shift stage. I want to take you through the other components of this page as they're representative of where we were in the crisis communications at the beginning, very much led by day-to-day, if not moment-to-moment changes in basic status. First, the banner. This banner we developed on the last day in the office, and we were really being funny. The person who sat across from me when we were office-based was our SharePoint administrator. She was helping me set this up. And she just sort of ran in my office with the hand sanitizer, since we were all using hand sanitizer, and said, should we make this the banner? I said, sure. She put it on my desk. She took a picture. We thought it was funny. This was the last thing my desk was ever used for. And then I have to admit that later when we went through the shift, we asked ourselves, is it okay that this is the banner? We know we were being funny when we put it up. Is it okay for something to be funny, given what's really going on around us now? Ultimately, we decided that it's still clearly symbolic of safety and of who we are. So we decided to keep it, but that conversation had to happen. The top left of the page, the focal point, shows that we were really focused on pushing out information. Posts to our town hall, all employee announcements. At first, this was just one office closure after another, whether to a building exposure or a state or local order. And we also provided tools and resources focused on making the technology work. For information outside our expertise, such as health information, we pointed, and still do, to trusted sources of information. And our updated response status, shown on the right here, was embedded on the page. Everything we posted and now post about COVID has the COVID-19 hashtag for easy search and for a clear record. We knew these details were the type of information our employees were seeking, so this is what we focused on. How did we know this is what they sought? Well, we had created opportunities for conversation that not only served employee needs, but also gave us insight. In addition to the top-down communication of the SharePoint site, we had the fully distributed, all-ways communication of our team site. We leveraged our autonomy-based culture for its best attributes, and staff truly stepped up to support each other. We knew what was going on with our staff because we provided a platform for active, open dialogue. On the left, you can see some of the channels we created for team work from home when we stood it up. There was a flurry of connecting and sharing that went on when this launched, but it still goes on. And we could sense people really wanted to remain connected to their colleagues. It was needed. We had immediately created channels in our team's environment for the work from home experience. We also were using our town hall channel for announcements, as we always do. And these generated comments and dialogue. We mined this for information that would give us an understanding of our employees' mindset and needs. By the beginning of April, though, we could tell the tenor was changing. Our offices were all closed and the pace of new, urgent, firm-related information was slowing. We all were aware this was turning into much more than a few weeks. That's why, for example, the CEO corner appears in the version of the COVID-19 Information Center we showed you. It's dated April 3rd, when our CEO issued the first of what has now become a weekly message to staff. His messages started then to express appreciation. They still do. And they also now help to give a roundup of the week across the firm, adding to the way we keep people connected. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, I received a message from an employee that these help her to feel connected to the company overall and to Brad, our CEO, specifically. His messages started then to express appreciation, as I said. This was the beginning, just the beginning of our transition to the next phase, prioritizing employee-specific resources over urgent change messages. But before we describe that shift, we want to give a few minutes for questions about what we've discussed so far. The longer Q&A will be at the end, But is there anything that's come up into the chat that we should address now?
Okay, Dina, I do have some questions that came into the chat. I'll go ahead and just read them in order. The first question is, actually, someone wants to know if your CEO writes his own blog post or if it's written for him.
Yes, so he always writes first and always sends to me for review. It's really important to him, actually, to make sure he writes first in his own voice. He asks for input. In fact, it's Thursday, so he sends out a message tomorrow. And so we all got, not by we all, leaders got today a message saying, do you have anything you think I should focus on in my message? Any shout outs for people on your team? He takes that in, he adds what he's focusing on, he writes something. I will receive that tomorrow just to give my input and review. And that's how we do it. But he's very tied to his voice, to being genuine in his voice, is I guess the way I would put that.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one for you. Does your prior experience in other organizations include strategy related to crisis communication? If so, were there a few key principles from those experiences that helped you with the events of 2020?
Yes. So yes, I've certainly been involved in crisis communication before. And so has Leanne. And I think that that's an aspect that made us different from others on the leadership team. Many people in CS leadership have been there forever. Our CEO started as a college intern. So we brought the experience of types of crisis that others hadn't had. And that's why we knew it was time to step in and start. So part of that is recognizing the signals. Part of that is recognizing how quickly you must work at that stage and the types of team members you have to bring together and the elements that you have to include. I mean, it would go on and on if we, I think, specified those elements, but Leanne, I'm sure you can add to that.
I guess one thing I'd like to add is that even if you don't have sort of experience in this realm, or I would just say that there's a lot of pieces that you can take from leadership training, especially if it's leading with empathy, that you can really, that'll really help guide during crisis and and communicating about a crisis.
Right. And I would also add, crisis communication is not necessarily different from other sensitive organizational communication. Understanding your stakeholders, responding to your stakeholders. The difference is you're doing it at a much faster pace. So you are depending a lot on your experience and your prior knowledge. And you'll see when we get to things at the end, some of what we talk about in terms of lessons is about taking some things from the crisis experience and making them normative experience so you're ready when a crisis hits.
Okay, thank you. Leanne, you mentioned a 300-person resource group. I believe it was Leanne. What's the name of that group? And is it something anyone can join?
I think that was the group Dina had mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm
so
sorry.
That's
yeah,
okay.
so it is a Teams group. It's run by CRA, which is a communications consulting group. And I can't answer for them who they will let in. I believe that the people involved in that are people that they're all, that they connect with through their consulting practice in various ways. But I invite folks, I guess, and they may or may not like me saying this, I invite folks to look up CRA. They are based in the greater Philadelphia area, but they're a national firm, and find out about the ways that they offer to connect with other professionals, because there's a number of them.
And then with the keeping in mind the spirit of independence in your culture that you mentioned earlier, were there steps that you had to take to make sure people understood the importance of adhering to remote work protocols, essentially turning what they need to do and what they want to do?
Yes, and that's still ongoing.
Yeah, I think that to Dina's point, That's an ongoing challenge for us as an organization. Because our profile is these independent sort of consultant, they have a lot of autonomy. Absolutely. I guess there's two sides of the coin here. I think that they adapted well to the remote environment because they're used to sort of running their projects the way they want them to. And some of them they're traveling all the time. They're sort of used to working out of hotels and airports. So I would say we have a population where the shift was very easy. But yeah, I mean, communication becomes a greater challenge when everyone is as remote. And so getting folks to check in with each other and make sure they're sort of on track with their projects and communicating across the firm was certainly, has always been a challenge for us and continues to be. So it's something that we're working on as part of the collective ambition that Dina mentioned earlier.
I will say,
Okay.
there's also protocols about just how we physically, technically choose to connect to each other just for a meeting, right? And we have standards, and some people choose to use them and some people choose not to. The work we're doing on diversity, equity, and inclusion has actually been extraordinarily helpful as a way to help people see why there might be standards. For example, we have people who say, I don't care if you say you hear better on Teams than on GoToMeeting. I prefer GoToMeeting and so forth. So I finally posted, hey, I actually have a hearing deficit. So this is an inclusion question, not a style question. And people get that. So it's a process, but there are tools to help people see things, that are important. But it's also important to know which things not to fight about.
Okay, and then there are just a couple more quick questions I want to make sure I get in before we go back to the presentation. The agency you were working with for your North Star work, was that an agency you had on retainer before COVID, or were they retained for COVID?
So for our collective ambition, the North Star, yeah, which is the collective ambition, so developing our North Star. So no, we had worked with CRA several years ago on another matter. I had worked with them previously. I've known them for years. We had brought them in to work with us on the collective ambition and its communication. And then COVID hit. So we were really leveraging work we had been doing with them and then adding to it our COVID stream, so to speak.
Okay, and then I'm going to end with this one that just came in. You both worked in much larger companies. How do you navigate the distrust that can exist between HR and the workforce, and even communications in the workforce? The reality is that there's often some tension between HR and comm. Do you have any suggestions on handling this if HR comm tension exists when crisis hits?
I think from my view, the best way to do that is to try to handle it before the crisis hits. So acknowledge tension that's there and find ways to be a partner. I generally try to address resistance by seeing where people need help and how I can be of help, not by offering where I think help should be provided. That's a process that allows you to build up that trust. And then later you have an opportunity when something's necessary to say, hey, sorry to step in, but I gotta tell you this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to build a relationship and the trust prior to the crisis hitting. But sometimes, things do happen and the crisis hits and you find out that you kind of just have to work together, even if you sort of weren't able to figure out sort of the swim lanes in the past, you kind of figure it out in the moment. So I suppose there's always that opportunity. But with the, I feel like my team and Dina's team work really well together because we communicate frequently. We have very open lines of communication. We collaborate. We talk about, we know who's playing what role in the communication, and we ask each other for help, and we have this sort of mentality that we're stronger together. So
right. But certainly I've been in the situations that the person who asked the question describes, and I think that if you come into the crisis not having resolved that tension, then you have to be, you have to say it. You have to say that the tension's there. You have to walk in and say, I know that we don't necessarily work that well together, that we have a lot to work out, but right now we have a crisis that's more important than our own issues, so let's work on it together.
Okay, thank you. And with that, let's go ahead back to the presentation, and if there's any questions I missed, I'll get them in at the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Okay, so I hope people enjoyed that 7th inning stretch.
Yes, and I just want to thank everyone for those great questions. Really appreciate you asking them and look forward to the next Q&A at the end. So the shift. We made the shift from urgent fluid communication to a more static site with HR-driven content. And this came about after a joint conversation with Dina and Karen, our SharePoint in-house expert that she mentioned earlier. And after the passing of 2 important pieces of legislation. So on this slide, you'll see what people needed was complex at this time and outside of their area of expertise. So when we created this, our vision was to provide a one-stop shop where employees could get information on pandemic-related benefit and paid leave changes, as well as resources for managing stress, accessing our employee assistance program, and tools for working remotely. Of course, we still kept all of the other information from the the previous version. And then the site evolved leading from links and posts and office-based information to leading with employee well-being-based information. It raised up the information that allows them to balance their work and personal needs. And you can see what's highlighted in the upper left. We specifically created a benefits and paid leave section. We also added a bolded line across the top, inviting employees to tell us what they needed from this information center. And it provided a link to a form in the lower page. And the box that I mentioned, the upper highlight box, leads to more detailed information about COVID-related benefits. And of course, we could have posted this on our HR page, but we felt that it belonged here instead because it was directly related to COVID-19. As I mentioned, the complexity and the personal nature of this information made it crucial to bring this to the forefront. And this slide highlights detailed information on the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, the Emergency Paid FMLA Expansion Act, and which resulted from the passing of the Families First Act. And it also provides our employees with information regarding benefit and retirement plan changes that were packaged as part of the CARES Act. I mean, there was a lot of information, as you all probably remember, that was coming at us, and it was coming at us quickly, and we had to make sense of it quickly, and we had to share it with our employees in a way that they could understand, and they could understand how it impacted them. So while it made sense at this point that the site was HR-led, we did recognize the need to be ready to look at the balance. Dina and I kept thinking through, when this might have to shift again at any time.
So through all of this, the COVID-19 working group remained active, sharing information continuously. Leanne and I continued to see it as our role to bring in perspectives from outside to introduce the employee experience and communication context as it was unfolding across firms around the country and around the world, and point out what we could learn, while others were focused on bringing forth financial, operational, infrastructure, and legal input. It became clear that we needed to begin making longer-term plans, and in doing so, to know more deeply about our employees' experience, needs, expectations, and fears. So on May 4th, we launched a survey to do just that. By May 18th, just 14 days later, we not only had all the results back, but we were sharing the reports on staff perception of our response to them, of our response to clients, of our work from home experience or their work from home experience, and of potential future steps in terms of work location, travel, and other factors. While communications was in a leading position on survey development, HR was in the leading position on the policy development that resulted. Our work intersects, We're partners. We each have our most appropriate leadership and team member roles that we pivot to readily.
Yeah, and the survey findings were, became foundational to the process and timelines we developed for potentially reopening offices and the policy regarding staff that could enter offices. And so when we created these protocols and policies, we considered the individual needs in order to be equitable across the organization. And while this approach certainly adds challenges, they are important ones to grapple with. For example, we've been very aware of how people with underlying health conditions could be impacted by our decisions and policies. This relates not only to office-based decisions, but also how we interact with our clients, who they express a range of expectations about our staff being present for in-person meetings. And we don't want our staff to feel pressured or to put themselves or their families at risk, nor will we allow their individual choices about this to impact their standing at the firm. So all decisions around returning to an office are based on data, as well as personal circumstance, and no one is required to open, even if we do decide to reopen an office.
So, and all of that came from this great knowledge we got from surveying our employees. And I must say about 80% of our employees participated in that survey. I then joined forces to help with how to communicate all of this policy out. We engaged the office directors and business leaders to prepare them first so they could be present and knowledgeable for their staffs once we announced our policies. We announced firm-wide and then asked those leaders to have conversations with their teams and ensure all questions were answered and bring those questions back to us. This was when we also created a 1CS Q&A blog and made it prominent on our SharePoint site. The shift also warranted a communication cadence plan that ensured all players could communicate effectively, appropriately, and in a timely manner across the streams of change communication, in combination with what clearly would be ongoing crisis communication, without drowning each other out or overwhelming staff. This cadence plan has served us well, and it gave us a baseline from which to adapt readily when the next big communication issue arose, with the intensified focus on racial justice, integrating it with our DEI and CEO communications. For all but ad hoc communications, every communication group and type has its time and place. This helps to establish and then live up to expectations for communication among employees, what I call the implied communication contract.
Yeah, and while this cadence, we stick to this as well as we can. Obviously, things change and come up, so we do adapt, and there's room to adapt. An example recently, IT reached out a couple weeks ago to my team because they had an urgent need to communicate something. And so what we did is we just, we shifted the weeks. And so we just keep the lines of communication open between teams, but then, recognize that we do have this sort of cadence and plan in place. So much of what we learned isn't just about how to move forward from a crisis, but what to take into the everyday and then be even better prepared when a crisis arises. So let's look at what we want to do better. We had been discussing for at least a year the need to strengthen our office leadership roles by both defining these roles better and by putting the right people in them. So an example of what I mean by developing our office leadership, looking back, it could have been investing in communication skills training. So had we done this, we would have been much more effective in getting office-based input for the COVID working group, the response team. And also we could have maybe sort of leaned on those folks to disseminate information out to their teams. So the lesson here is look at your leadership roles and how effectively they are developed and invested in, and make this an area of constant focus and maintenance so you're ready when they're most needed.
So we focus on bringing innovative thinking to our go-to-market work. One of our strategic priorities is to grow and innovate with intention. And a key aspect of our leadership in our industry is our reputation for bringing innovative thinking to our clients. And yet we've tended to overlook that same innovative approach to our internal work. And we've even eschewed it as we've maintained pretty traditional points of view about things like organizational structure, place-based work, and employee communication. Had we been more innovative, we could have effected an even smoother transition for our staff. We also might have been more intentional about creating common culture across our offices and other groups using our technology tools much sooner. We'd also likely be in a better place to take advantage of the current state. For example, had we better considered 2 or 3 years ago other ways to work, we might now not be locked into leases that will delay our ability to take advantage of a more streamlined real estate strategy. So the lesson here is to be more imaginative and innovative internally. Use that external growth focus on your internal structures and processes. As part of this, read and think broadly as a rule to recognize opportunities early. In crisis, this will mean being a step ahead instead of a step behind the onset and the shifts, and to adopt novel approaches for communication and response to employees.
And what we want to institutionalize and leverage moving forward is we want to leverage the COVID-19 working group to handle future emergent decisions. For example, if we had to shut down an office due to a hurricane. We just felt the combination of perspectives, the ability to act quickly, and decision-making authority were powerful and critical to our success. So the lesson here is establishing an ongoing crisis response group. Another lesson is around our virtual culture. As Dina showed you some of the slides on the Teams platform, we've really extended our water cooler beyond the walls of our offices and have reached, conversations are happening between people that have never happened before based on where we were located. So we want to continue with that and make sure that when we're celebrating, and even if we're back in offices, we keep that virtual water cooler and team building environment open. The other thing to mention under our virtual culture, we've seen sort of an equalizing factor of this, everyone working remotely. In the past, we've had, our meetings taking place in person, maybe 1 or 2 people dialing in or calling in for that meeting. And it creates a little bit of, it marginalizes the folks that are not in the room because they're missing out on side conversations and potentially body language. So this really is an equalizing factor for us. And though we already had the technology in place 10 months before the crisis, we'd really been ignoring the opportunities right in front of us to use this technology in this way. So the lesson here is to be expansive in conceiving of work culture. The more expansive, the more inclusive.
The CEO through this process has really seen the best of our employees, and this has changed how he communicates and his openness to new ideas. Really a greater trust in staff, so that, for example, he believes that they can work in a flexible work arrangement, and he was never sure of that before. It's a two-way street. Our response has also engendered an extraordinary level of employee trust and goodwill, which we can leverage for our change initiatives. And it's critical we institutionalize behaving and responding in ways that continue to foster this in truly genuine ways. The social justice crisis became an opportunity to test this, and the increased trust that had developed really emboldened employees and the newly formed DEI Council in particular, but not solely, to take charge of their message and channels and make their positions known. And the increased trust also opened the CEO to be responsive to those messages. So the lesson here is be emboldened by assuming the best of staff in how and what you communicate. They likely will rise to that expectation. Finally, we already had a trusting, communicative HR comms working relationship, so we were fortunate in that. And this clearly was a success factor. Now, we may want to explore whether and how we might more formally connect internal communications and HR. We don't have the answer to that yet. We're starting those conversations. But the lesson is to look at natural partnerships that are forming and ask whether they suggest more formal intersection. And now we're open to your questions. Anything else that might have come in from the chat?
All right, thank you, Dina and Leanne, for bringing those insights to us. And now we're ready to entertain your questions. You should see the things to think about slide we shared at the beginning of the program. A number of questions and comments came in during the session, and you may have seen some shared with other attendees in the chat. I'll go ahead and read some of the questions that came in the chat while people are formulating their other questions. Here's one about the virtual culture. What are some specific actions that you've taken to maintain that inclusive virtual culture? Can you share any of that information?
Yeah, so actually, we do keep looking at what the data. So for example, when it was clear that the coffee, we have a sort of a coffee break channel. When it was clear that that was getting less leverage and others were getting more, we took out the sort of forced reminders that, you know, a coffee hour was coming up because it was less important to people. They were creating their own. So we watch that. We look at the issues that are happening. We've created channels more recently around sort of the care and comfort of people as they're dealing with diversity and inclusion issues that have become very, very active. So those channels aren't necessarily going to be about work from home as we evolve, but we're very intentional about looking at what the use of channels is and adapting them to where our employees are. We also never stop reminding our leaders to have sessions with their own team. For example, last night I had a little happy hour with my team, and that was somebody reporting to me, reminding me, you know, it's been a while since you've done one of those virtual happy hours. So we keep each other accountable to that.
Okay, thank you for that.
Leanne?
I'd just
Go
like
ahead,
to add, can I add a little bit to that, Greg?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add one of the other things that I would like to see us do to keep this, the inclusion aspect. I think our employees have really appreciated that we keep asking them for their input. And it's something that we could have been doing a better job at that, doing it more frequently and sort of in just an easy and like a simplistic way. So that's something that, you know, I want to really think about adding to the mix, just making sure we're doing more frequent pulse checks and getting people's input as we make business decisions.
Yeah, that's actually another way that we can leverage what came out of this, because previous to this, I think Leanne and I would hit a wall with other leaders saying, you know, it overwhelms our people when you keep asking. It overwhelms our people when you keep, you know, doing little surveys. And I think we just proved that actually our people really want us to do it. And now everyone believes us when we say that. So crisis helped with that.
Great. Here's a question about message segmentation. For global companies, COVID-19 is not at the crisis level it is in the US currently. Were you able to segment your messaging via SharePoint to cater to specific audiences?
To a degree, we don't have, we are national, we are not global. So we don't have some of those challenges, but we have channels that are for everyone. We also have channels that are specific for specific groups and including specific geography groups. So we absolutely have the ability to segment messages and segment communication among groups based upon those specifics. We certainly have considerable differences in the way that the crisis is being felt in different parts of our geography as a company. And we knew that, for example, early on, we needed to communicate with and to our New York-based employees in a somewhat different way than we might have needed to communicate with others. And we did make that happen in very personalized ways. And Leanne, you can probably talk about some of the ways in which HR in particular reached out to those groups.
Yeah, I mean, we did have to Dina's point, we don't have the global, it's not that impact that we have. We did reach out specifically to people in our New York office, just to sort of, again, checking in on that human level, also empathizing with the fact that they, once they were in small apartments with, it was hard for them, it was harder for them to work from home than it was for some of our other population. But then on the flip side, in the beginning in our offices in Florida, they weren't quite understanding why we would be considering closing an office. So we had to sort of communicate specifically to those office leaders. And this is what brings me back to the lesson around, I wish we had done a little bit more development with our office directors, because when it comes down to these moments where things are kind of, you need to have a different approach based on the office, I think we really could have leveraged that a little better, so.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I would say that is a place to use your regional or local leadership as communicators. Build them up as communicators, because that's really important when crisis affects different communities
Okay.
within.
For your next question, I want to combine, it's essentially 3 questions combined into one multi-part. First, someone wanted to commend you guys for using an interactive process to help frame your communications pattern, cadence, content, and they specifically mentioned the employee survey. What was the most surprising thing you learned from that survey?
Oh my, I would say the most surprising thing we learned was wonderful. 98, I mean, I've never seen a number like this. 98% of our employees said they were extremely pleased or pleased with the way leadership had responded to them and to our clients.
Then along those lines, did your survey include clients?
No, the survey did not include clients, but we were asking our employees basically to comment based upon their interactions with our clients and how they, the perception our employees had of how we responded. We were, however, constantly, as a company, on the phone with our clients, gathering their input. I will say this, we knew that we were going to protect our employees from demands made by our clients that sat outside the comfort zone of our employees. And so we had to be very cautious to ensure we were working with data that put our employees first. And leadership will actually provide cover to our clients as needed.
Okay, I think that probably answers some of the most challenging to address is probably those working relationship questions that really kind of fell out of the scope of the intent of the survey. Is that an accurate assessment, you think?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that. Say that again.
The most challenging responses to address seem like it might be those client-based requests that you really couldn't put the employee first in.
Those can be the most challenging. The most challenging things to respond to from the survey itself.
Right.
A lot of it had to do around comfort. So, for example, and this came up in actually one of the pre-questions that came in, is what are we doing to sort of help people just navigate the day-to-day of being at home? People are saying, I'm not comfortable. I'm not set up for an office. My chair hurts, when I have to do this day after day. I don't have enough paper. I don't, in many ways, those days, that day-to-day stuff is the most challenging, because that gets to figuring it out how long people are going to have to do this, what we can do for their comfort while also considering our financial obligations, those kinds of things. That's still a work in progress. Leanne, do you have any other particular challenge out of the survey?
I would just say that, I mean, the surprise was also yours. I want people to realize that, you know, there was a point of view prior to this that we were sort of in a corporate bubble. So the fact that people felt that we were meeting their needs and they were happy with our response was sort of a surprise for us. It broke culture a little bit there. And the other piece on what you just asked about the challenges, I mean, a crisis is so personal and there's so many other factors involved. And so it's just very challenging to make decisions, sort of company-wide decisions, when everyone has such individualized needs and challenges. And I think that what helped us in that is we sort of had a guiding principle where it was like, the goal is to keep our employees safe and to preserve them and to preserve their jobs. And it's like, if everything sort of feeds into that, it helped us in guiding all of our decisions around, you know, how we move forward.
Yeah.
All right. Dina and Leanne, thank you very much. It's been great talking with you today, but it is time to wrap up our conversation. Thank you for being with us. Everyone wants to make sure you're aware of a few quick notes as we part company. If you have further questions for Dina and Leanne, you can contact them at the email addresses shown on the slide. Please complete the participant survey. It will open as you exit. Watch your email for details on our August region webinar, a panel discussion on diversity, inclusion, and communication to be presented in conjunction with IABC Detroit. If you'd like to present as a future webinar, please email the Boston chapter or the IABC Heritage region. And finally, here are a few resources for you. To learn about IABC membership benefits, go to iabc.com/membership. And thank you again for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.